From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. On today's program, we'll be talking about Iranian foreign policy and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO. Amid growing concerns about the regional repercussions of the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the SCO met for its 20th anniversary summit in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, on September 16th and 17th. Regional security cooperation and Iranian accession were at the top of the agenda, with Iran formally joining the organization as a full member on September 17th. We'll be talking to Alex Vatanka, senior fellow and head of MEI's Iran program, about Iran's foreign policy objectives and what membership in the SCO might and might not mean for Tehran. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers, as well as our Arabic language program, Podcast Al-Awsat, hosted by MEI senior fellow Ibrahim Al-Asl. First up on the program, we'll be hearing from Iulia Sabina-Joja, director of MEI's Afghanistan Watch Project and a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative, about how the SCO has evolved in recent years and its potential role in regional security cooperation. Iulia, welcome back to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Iulia, how has the Shanghai Cooperation Organization evolved over time, especially with the inclusion of India and Pakistan in 2017?
So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or SCO, is a regional political, economic, and security grouping in Asia. The SCO emerged out of an initial group of 5 member states known as the Shanghai Five back in 2001. And its power dynamic revolves around China and Russia, who act really as the driving forces of the SCO today. The SCO includes, along with China and Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and since 2017, India and Pakistan. And also, Iran and Afghanistan, as well as others, are observer states. That's their status right now. And the heads of member states within the SCO meet on a yearly basis, usually. From a security perspective, the major tasks of the SCO, also known as the 3 evils these countries share, are combating terrorism, extremism, and separatism. Member states hold also regular military exercises targeted at these 3 problems. Politically, the SCO brings together China and Russia and their regional allies with the rationale of contributing to a multipolar world and to oppose intervention in internal affairs on the pretext of humanitarianism and protecting human rights. This can also be read as opposing US and Western supremacy, particularly for China and even more so for Russia, who has been the main advocate of developing SCO security cooperation. And while security-wise and politically, Russia is the main driver, from an economic perspective, the main driver is China, who has been keen to build initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative into the SCO to secure regional access to resources. Since 2007, the SCO initiated a multitude of large-scale projects related to transportation, energy, and telecommunications. And this has been taken even more power and energy with India and Pakistan joining in 2017.
Iulia, what role can the SCO potentially play in dealing with some of the emerging regional security challenges regarding Afghanistan?
For one, Afghanistan is an observer country to the SCO and has been trying to gain full membership since 2015 without success. With the return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan, it goes without saying that full membership is off the table, at least for now. At the same time, the SCO and its priority in fighting terrorism and extremism increase in relevance right now. In a sense, one of the SCO's founding reasons has been the civil war in Afghanistan and the conflict spillover into the region from conflicts such as the Tajikistan civil war in the 90s, the issues between the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, as well as in Kashmir, in Chechnya, and even in China's Xinjiang. In addition to Pakistan and India to the SCO, having them join has actually deepened fault lines between SCO members, including on counterterrorism efforts. For instance, India has refused participation in counterterrorism exercises given New Delhi's problems with China and Pakistan. So it's difficult to imagine any concrete measures with real effects adopted by the SCO, given such diverse membership right now. On the issue of the Taliban and the risk of terrorism and extremism in the larger region, SCO positions right now couldn't be more divided. China and Russia have shown interest, as we've seen, in working with the Taliban. Pakistan is well known for its close but complicated relationship with Afghanistan and the Taliban. And on the opposite side lie countries like Tajikistan and India, both very concerned with the Taliban's rise to power. With the return of the Taliban to power, what unites right now all SCO members is the fear of conflict spill over into their countries, just like we've seen in the 90s and early 2000s. This has been clear at the July 2021 SCO meeting that revolved around Afghanistan, when the 8 members agreed on reinvigorating regional anti-terrorism institutions. And on September 16, another SCO meeting took place in Dushanbe, revolving again around Afghanistan, which reflects the concern of Afghanistan's neighbors in light of the new Taliban government and the regional security and instability risks that come with it.
Iulia, what does an expanded SCO mean for U.S. regional interests?
The rationale of the SCO for its main drivers and powers, China and Russia, has been really counterbalancing the United States and the West in the region. In the first 2 decades, it was mainly Russia who drove the security rationale under the narrative of multipolar world, sovereignty, and opposing external intervention into internal affairs under the pretext of protecting human rights. Russia has also traditionally seen Central Asian countries as a bit of its own backyard. So while combating regional terrorism is on paper a priority the SCO shares with the United States, in reality, deteriorating US-Russian relations have played an important role in countering American regional interests. The year when this has become most evident was 2014, when the last US base in Central Asia was closed. In the same year, the United States opposed sanctions on Russia following the illegal annexation of Ukraine's Crimea. And in the same year, Russia decided to cease cooperation with the United States in the Afghanistan operation. And though China is not as keen as Russia in shaping the SCO into a hard security organization, Beijing's interests in counterbalancing the United States through the SCO has certainly increased under the Trump administration. Pakistan and India, 2 US allies joining the SCO, and the just ended US withdrawal from Afghanistan are detrimental to US regional interests. Each of these events means less of an American foothold in the region. With the Biden administration's continued pivot to Asia, we are likely to see the Asian continent and US allies such as India and Pakistan increasingly divided between security cooperation with an increasingly territorially absent US, but a US also with a stronger anti-China narrative, and security cooperation with China and Russia on the other side, including through the SCO. So this relationship between all of these elements will likely lead to increased divisions within the SCO and within the larger Asian continent.
Thank you for joining us today, Iulia.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Iulia Sabina-Joja, the director of MEI's Afghanistan Watch Project and a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative. You can follow all of the analysis and updates from both Afghanistan Watch and Frontier Europe on our website at www.mei.edu. Next up, Alex Vatanka, director of MEI's Iran program, will be joining us to discuss Iranian foreign policy and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Alex, welcome back to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alistair.
Alex, let's dive right in. This is the first foreign trip for Iran's new president, Ibrahim Raisi, who was sworn in just last month. What does it tell us that his first foray abroad as president is to the SCO summit in Dushanbe?
Well, I think the fact that he's going to this summit in Dushanbe, it was to be expected. Most Iranian presidents have tried to attend this summit when the opportunity has been there. Timing-wise, it just happens to more or less coincide with Raisi, arriving at the presidential palace. I wouldn't read too much into it. What I would read plenty into is the fact that we can expect Raisi to attend the UN week in New York just in a few weeks' time. So that, to me, is the story here. The fact that he's going to the summit in Dushanbe doesn't necessarily tell us much. It's more or less something you would have anticipated an Iranian president to do. What remains to be seen is whether Iran will be offered something that looks like the beginning of full membership. It's been an observer state since 2008 in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has desperately wanted to become a full member. It has been kept out over the years. Again, we have to see if something that looks like the beginning of full membership will be offered to Raisi. If that's the case, I am convinced that Raisi's hardline supporters back in Tehran will proclaim this as the moment where, Iran will cease caving into Western demands and will go ahead and full-fledged commit itself to integration to what he calls the Greater Eurasia, meaning Russia and China and other states in that part of the world.
Alex, let's drill down in that a little bit more. Why is the process of joining the SCO been so complicated and problematic for Iran? Why is it taken this many years?
I mean, there is no good answer to that. There's speculation. Certainly some things have been put out there that tells us, or at least point to reasons that might have contributed to why Iran has waited so long to become a full member. For example, we don't really know if the Chinese were initially comfortable with having Iran as a full member. Later on, Vladimir Putin of Russia pointed out that countries that are under UN sanctions shouldn't join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. He said at a time when Iran was under sanctions because of its controversial nuclear program. Later on, the country of Tajikistan, a founding member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, kind of fell out with Iran and accused Iran to support militant Islamists in Tajikistan and therefore as a veto power. And every member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization has a veto power when it comes to enlargement of that organization. And the Tajiks, if the reports are true, didn't want Iran in at the time. This is a few years ago, though. Tajikistan-Iran relations have improved radically in the last year or two. I suspect the arrival or re-emergence of Taliban in Kabul is a big factor. Tajikistan is extremely upset about what is happening in Afghanistan and is looking for like-minded countries in the region to cooperate with vis-a-vis the threat from Taliban. And Iran is one of those countries. So at the moment, the Tajik opposition is gone. The Chinese and the Russians are providing plenty of diplomatic support for Iran and places like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. So, in other words, it looks like the momentum is going in Iran's direction. But again, we have to wait and see if full membership will indeed be offered to Iran while Raisi is in Dushanbe for the summit.
Alex, why is SCO membership so important for Tehran, and what would Iran gain from becoming a member?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, when you think about the membership, I mean, remember in 2017, India and Pakistan also joined as full members of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I think a lot of people in Tehran are asking that question. They're saying, yes, it's not a bad thing to join with the neighbors to deal with certain issues. For example, insurgency, separatism, terrorism, which are the pillars that the sort of reasons why SCO was founded back in the day. But they argue it's not going to help Iran overcome its real troubles of present day, which are, dealing with sanctions and helping rescue the economy, and also to deal with Iran's troubled relations with countries to its south in the Arab world. So SCO is basically Russia, China, and Central Asian states plus Pakistan and Iran. Whereas Iranian investment in terms of its foreign policy that are controversial, and the reason why it's at loggerheads with its Arab neighbors in the West, are to Iran's west, in places like Syria, Iraq, in the Gulf region. So certainly not a silver bullet to Iran's problems. And I think plenty of people recognize that in Tehran. It's, for example, not going to help Iran overcome its problems that it has vis-a-vis the United States over its nuclear program. What it does offer, and I think that's the argument of supporters of it in Tehran, is that it will be the first time, for example, since 1979, that Iran actually joins a relatively decent-sized international organization. And it sort of helps, perhaps, to work against the idea that Iran is isolated and alone out there. It might just psychologically be a positive step for them, for the Iranian regime to take. But as I said, it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to deal with some of the key issues that Iran needs to deal with urgently now. At best, the SCO will provide a platform for cooperation with other member states in the longer term.
Flipping things around, Alex, what would the SCO gain from having Iran join as a full member as opposed to just being an observer?
Right away, I would say what's going on in Afghanistan seems to provide a reasonable platform to expect cooperation to happen around. I mean, if you believe the agenda of SCO, which is to deal with Islamism, militancy of any kind, terrorism, then the arrival or return of Taliban makes it necessary for countries around Afghanistan to work together. That means China, Iran, the Central Asian states, and further afield, Russia, have reason to want to collaborate. So bringing Iran in as a full member might just be the type of step you need to take to prepare for a worst-case scenario in Afghanistan, which would basically be civil war, a return of civil war in that country. But this is all on paper, Alistair. I mean, SCO hasn't, to my knowledge, really ever been an organization that has acted in a way where we can say they were instrumental in changing circumstances on the ground. I can't point to a single conflict anywhere in Eurasia where SCO was pivotal player. But that doesn't mean it can play a bigger role going forward. But one final point I make is this: if Iran thinks that SCO membership and puts it together with other anti-American states, and that this is part of Iran's, hope to spread its message that confronting the United States should be the priority number one, then I think it will be left disappointed. Certainly countries like India and Pakistan, and I would say the Central Asian states, they're not in SCO to turn it into anti-American bloc. They're in there to deal with real issues on the ground when it comes to militancy, terrorism, secessionism, and so forth. And if Iran gets that message early and collaborates with them, I think it would do itself a favor.
Alex, how does this fit into President Raisi's broader foreign policy agenda, or at least what we know about it so far? It's obviously early days at this point.
I mean, his foreign policy agenda has so far been mostly symbolic. This idea that look east, meaning, again, China and Russia, and focusing on Asia in the general sense has been what he has expressed in terms of something that looks like if you will, a foreign policy agenda. This is not new. This has been tried before. Last president in Iran who focused so much on the East was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005. He kind of pushed that agenda. And frankly, the Iranians didn't get much out of it. I mean, on core issues where, for example, they wanted diplomatic support, China and Russia during the Obama administration repeatedly voted with the United States against Iran. On another point, the Chinese and the Russians have never really invested in a major way in Iran. I mean, China trades with Iran quite a bit, but most of that is buying and selling to each other in the sense of Iranian energy going to China and Chinese goods coming to Iran. But if you're looking for long-term economic investments by the Chinese in Iran in infrastructure and so forth, that hasn't really happened. So I think, the more level-headed analysts in Tehran believe that the rise of China is a fact of life. The fact that Russia is a neighbor of Iran is a fact of life. But the other fact of life is if you want international recognition that you're a normal state and should be deserved to be heard and respected and your interests taken into account, then Iran really needs to deal with the Western world as well. That includes obviously the United States, the Europeans, and it includes also Iran's Arab neighbors that are so anxious about Iranian regional policy. So, I think on balance, what Raisi, if he wanted to be more successful, he can't just go and chase this pipe dream that all Iran solutions can be solved by looking to East, i.e. China and Russia. History shows that it hasn't happened. It's unlikely to happen this time around too. What they need to do is to look to East, but at the same time not forget that some of the key or urgent challenges that Iran has to deal with the nuclear issue, to reduce tensions across the board in the Middle East, they need to have a dialogue also with Western countries and with some of Iran's Arab neighbors like Saudi Arabia, like UAE and so forth. Time will show if Raisi would be that kind of a president to sort of undertake what would amount to pretty ambitious review of Iranian foreign policy of the last decade or two.
Alex, you touched on the issue of Afghanistan earlier, but I wanted to kind of circle back to that. Obviously, Afghanistan and the potential regional ripple effects from that will be front and center on the agenda in Dushanbe. What are Tehran's major concerns on that front right now?
I think the worst case scenario for the Iranians right now is a return of civil war in Afghanistan. They will end up getting potentially hundreds of thousands of millions of Afghan migrants and refugees coming their way. Their history of that in the past. The Iranians have wanted to pretend, at least publicly, that this is a new Taliban, that this is a moderate Taliban. It should be encouraged to form an inclusive government, which Taliban already has disappointed on. As we heard from a leading former Afghan figure, Ismail Khan, who is now in the city of Mashhad in Iran, he's just said this week that, yes, Iran should continue to insist that Taliban are going to include more religious and ethnic minorities in the government. That, he said, is far-fetched, though. And Ismail Khan is already, and again, he's a prominent Afghan figure. I don't know how representative his views are across the board, but Ismail Khan's point is, yes, push for the Taliban to moderate their tone, their policies, but if they don't, be ready to go to war. Be ready to help us, meaning Afghans who are on the fence right now with the Taliban. But if they decide, these Afghans like Ismail Khan, if they decide to sort of join what is happening in Panjshir and the opposition to Taliban, that Iran should be willing to help them. That's a real challenge for the Iranian policy in Afghanistan. So I would say the following, Alistair. Yes, on the surface, Iran says this is a new Taliban, but the reality is that they know Taliban hasn't changed that much. And the other thing they don't know, like the rest of the world, is who will win that power struggle within the Taliban movement, the so-called moderates or the so-called hardliners. Iran has sway over some Taliban members like Mullah Baradar, who they negotiated with since 2019. The Iranians have zero influence over the Haqqani network. So who wins that power struggle within Taliban also will greatly shape Iran's future policy vis-a-vis Afghanistan.
Just building on that, Alex, how much appetite do you think there is in Tehran for either kind of more active regional cooperation or more aggressive actions on the issue of Afghanistan?
I mean, let me take the latter. Aggressive action right now is something Iran can really not afford. I mean, they are hugely sanctioned. They are broke. I mean, the Iranian economy right now is teetering on bankruptcy. They have a very angry public in Iran that is extremely upset about Ayatollah Khamenei and his leadership, resulting in Iran being so isolated, so sanctions. So, how much Iran has in the tank to devote to a new foreign policy project is very questionable. And it doesn't help the fact that they have invested so heavily in the Arab world for ideological reasons. And here they are dealing with an existential threat next door in the neighbor in Afghanistan, and their capacity to deal with it is, as I said, questionable. So that does argue for Iran encouraging more regional cooperation. Specifically, I think the Iranians would be wise to push Pakistan as much as they can, although I don't know how much Iran can actually push and shape Pakistani steps in Afghanistan. Certainly, Pakistan has the closest relationship with the Taliban movement, and the Iranians can, through Pakistan, if they have any leverage in Islamabad, try and shape Taliban's policies, and again push for something that looks like a national government and a national movement to reconcile and prevent that worst case scenario we all fear, which is civil war. But again, that is an unknown. Whether Iran can and bring about or encourage, facilitate regional dialogue over Afghanistan is one scenario. The other scenario, which we should all hope will be avoided, is the return to the 1990s, where you got a zero-sum game competition for influence in Afghanistan, where countries basically, link up. In the case of Iran, it linked up with Russia and India and Tajikistan in the 1990s against the Taliban then, and Pakistan, the Gulf states, supported the Taliban at the time. That would be a worst-case scenario. But right now, the Taliban is still speaking the language of a moderation. The Pakistanis are promising that they will do what they can to moderate Taliban's attitude. But all of these are promises, and I think action will speak louder, and we'll just wait and see what will happen in the next few weeks and months with Taliban's actions in Afghanistan.
Shifting gears a little bit before we wrap up, you referenced the UN General Assembly earlier, which is coming up later this month, and Raisi's potential trip to New York for that. If he goes, what are your expectations?
I doubt very much he will go. I mean, there's already a campaign underway to sort of make sure that doesn't happen. He might not be known to the rest of the world, but he was a key player in political execution of dissidents back in the late 1980s in Iran. And Iranian opposition is very much pushing hard to make sure he becomes a persona non grata in places like the United Nations. I doubt Raisi will go. If he does go, what's he going to seek to achieve? I mean, he's already said he doesn't want to meet President Biden. So it kind of raises the issue of, if you're going to the United Nations just simply to use that podium to repeat old talking points of the Islamic Republic, then there's really, really little value in that. And I'm sure it'll backfire on him. I mean, the Iranian people have heard talking points of the Islamic Republic officials for 42 years, and they see where they are now in terms of their economy and the suffering that the Iranian public is faced with. So I think we can expect Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdullahian to arrive in New York if he gets an American visa. That remains to be seen. Remember, the Trump administration did not issue a visa to Abdullahian's predecessor, Javad Zarif. But in terms of this most senior Iranian official to come, I doubt it would be Raisi. It would just, send the wrong signal for his camp back in Tehran, because they're supposed to be all about the East and standing up to the West. So I'll be surprised if Raisi does show up. Let's just put it that way.
We're running short on time, but before we conclude, any final thoughts on the outlook for Iranian foreign policy under Raisi?
No, I would just say, anybody who looks at Iran's foreign policy challenges right now really has to conclude that the last 10 years of Iranian foreign policy in terms of maintaining alliances with like-minded parties out there, be it Assad in Syria or Hamas or Hezbollah and so on, they have perhaps been successes in their own right, but one thing they all have failed to do is to improve the living standards of folks back in Iran. Hasn't done anything to increase legitimacy for the Islamic Republic. And that fundamentally is the problem, not just Raisi faces, but the entire leadership in the Islamic Republic, including Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei face. So I don't know if they're going to take a moment and review the overall foreign policy agenda and look at Raisi's arrival as a moment to maybe turn a page. Again, I doubt it. But this would have been a perfect moment for them because now the hardline camp controls every lever of power in Tehran. They have no one to fear. They can do things as they wish or as they see fit to deliver for the Iranian people. But as I said, I'm not holding my breath.
We'll have to leave things there for now, but thanks for coming on the show today, Alex.
Thank you, Alistair. Pleasure.
That was Alex Vatanka, director of MEI's Iran program. You can follow MEI's Iran coverage on our website at www.mei.edu. That's all the time we have this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.